A very warm welcome to you all. So we are going to continue our conversation on the second panel, substantive panel of the day, which is on harnessing technologies to build a better future. And this panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Adam Lupel, who is the Vice President and COO of IPI. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you. We've got the survivors from the morning still here, and it's a tech panel, so I think we've got a really robust audience online, which is great. It's been a really great discussion so far, I would say, and already there's quite a bit to respond to, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to do a bit of that in this session. This morning, Adam Day, in his report from Geneva Peace Week, mentioned in his pitch why it's important to bridge the work of International Geneva with New York, that Geneva-based institutions have a special expertise on technology issues. And so this will be our focus on this panel, which is one of two panels on technology issues that we'll be having in this seminar, Geneva Peace Week Meets New York. Our closing panel tomorrow will be specifically on AI for peace, but we're going to cast our net a bit broader today, but also touch on some of the AI issues as well. New technologies such as social media, for example, which were meant to bring the world closer, are being weaponized, as we say in the concept note, being manipulated to create divisions and sow distrust. We talked a bit in the first session about the issue of trust as at the core of the challenges facing the multilateral system today. But we also recognize that new technologies can and should be brought to bear on the peace-building sector in order to counter these divisions, harmful effects, and other impacts of these actions and technologies. IPI has been doing a bit of work on this, in particular in research by my colleague Albert Trittart, who's here, on disinformation against UN peacekeeping, and also on the UN's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've also done some work through our Women, Peace, and Security program on convening on how to use positively innovation and technology to advance gender equality. Other issues were also mentioned this morning. Hiba on the last panel noted the challenge of divisive misinformation during election campaigns that is putting pressure on our democratic institutions. I think something that we're all really quite aware of, and I think not just in this country, but globally, looking ahead to 2024 with quite trepidation. So the challenges are many. But our colleague from DPPA, Sasha, noted, I thought quite interesting in the last panel, that one of the lessons of the whole common agenda and new agenda for peace process has been that we are kind of coming to an emerging consensus about the many problems that we face. And that consensus then points to the potential for solutions. So that means we need to follow the SG's lead to be frank about the problems, but not cynical about the opportunities. These problems are, to borrow David's hashtag from the earlier session, intractable, but not impossible. So we talked just briefly before about how we want to frame this discussion a bit on, talk about some of the risks, these problems, but also the opportunities, and then have a forward-looking conversation and anticipation of the Summit of the Future about what policies, what kinds of governance structures then do we need to mitigate these risks and take advantage of the opportunities. We ask, how can new technologies be regulated for good in peace building and sustaining peace, and what are the implications of different technologies on the future of peace building? So we have a great panel here to discuss all of this. Um, we will first be turning to, I said Mavic is going first, right? Yeah. We'll first turning to Mavic Cabrera Balleza, who is the founder and chief executive officer of the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, GNWP. Her leadership and collaboration with civil society, we've been talking a fair amount about Geneva's role in incorporating civil society, has led to the establishment of two important global mechanisms, the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, WPHF, and the Generation Equality Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action. And she was also a founding board member of the WPHF and is the current co-chair of the Board of Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Compact. Mavic, it's really a pleasure to have you here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this panel, Harnessing Technologies to Build Better Future. That's what we all want, right? And it's happening during this exciting Geneva Peace Week meets New York. Many thanks to the Geneva Peace Building Platform, the International Peace Institute, and of course, the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs for supporting this exciting initiative. This discussion comes at a crucial time when, while we recognize digital technologies as vital to our peace building, networking, and solidarity building, we also see them as instruments, fueling conflicts, threatening democracy and human rights, and attacking women peace builders and human rights defenders. As Adam already underscored, they are being weaponized against most of the issues that we work with, against women peace builders and human rights defenders. And women are generally much more likely than men to be targeted online, particularly on violence and sexual abuse. With support from the Swiss Directorate of International Law, our organization, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, in partnership with ICT for Peace Foundation, that my fellow panelist Anne-Marie Buzatu is representing, we have been working on research and advocacy, focusing on the linkage between women, peace, and security and cybersecurity since 3 years ago. And in this work, we've examined the use of the information and communication technologies by women and youth peace builders, the benefits that they gain from using it or using them, and the risks that they face. And we also analyze the synergy or lack thereof between national action plans on women, peace, and security, which are the principal instruments that governments use or supposed to use to honor their obligations under the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and their linkages to national strategies on cybersecurity. And I want to share some of our findings in our research and advocacy. First, women peace builders and youth peace builders worldwide use digital technologies extensively to strengthen their participation in peace processes, in policy drafting and decision-making. For example, in participating in global and regional policy fora, including discussions with the Security Council and Peace Building Commission. They use the technologies in consultations with other peace builders from around the world, indirect engagement with peace negotiators, and in advocating for peace agreements. As we know, there have been a number of peace agreements that have been signed in different parts of the world in conflict-affected countries and regions, but that's just one part of the work. The bigger part is implementing peace agreements, and some of these peace agreements have been violated even literally before the ink that was used to sign them has dried. And the digital technologies are really helpful in pushing for the implementation of peace agreements. And women peace builders also use the technologies for conflict prevention, response to sexual and gender-based violence, and for early warning, including for raising awareness of increasing levels of sexual and gender-based violence, which, as many of us know, is one of the drivers of conflict. Women peace builders have also used the digital technologies very actively in relief and recovery, in organizing humanitarian response, in disseminating information about healthcare, including reproductive health care and psychosocial support. And this was most evident during the COVID pandemic and in more recent humanitarian emergencies and still ongoing, such as the war in Ukraine and the aftermath of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, as well as the earthquakes and other natural disasters that happen in that country. And while digital technologies have created countless opportunities for women and youth peace builders, they have also contributed to the exclusion and increased the vulnerabilities of many. For one, women peace builders experience distinct gender cyber threats and risks. For example, in South Sudan and Yemen, women who have been participating in peace negotiations and calling for the implementation of peace agreements have been specifically targeted and discredited online. And they usually don't happen to their male counterparts, to the male negotiators. It's mostly only the women. The 2023 report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence also documented that in South Sudan, again, and in Sudan and Myanmar, advocates and activists who were intervening to assist survivors of sexual and other forms of violence during conflict were harassed and threatened online. And as we know, threats and risks online easily translate to violence offline. One of the Armenian activists that we interviewed for our earlier research captured this increasing risks they face compellingly when she said that anyone who writes about peace, advocates for peace, can be a target. It is so easy to be targeted on social media. You just need to write something about coming to a dialogue, about broadening the peace negotiations, and that's all that need to be said for you to be easily attacked online. And these risks and threats often remain unaddressed by government policies and programs. And in the few times when they address them, poor implementation continues to be a barrier for ensuring cybersecurity, particularly for women and girls. But as we know, women are never passive victims. They take action to address the problems. And in the face of online threats, women play a critical role as cybersecurity providers. They take on this role that states and telecommunication companies do not do, or do it as a token gesture. They do so by providing cybersecurity capacity building training, advocating for digital human rights, and holding governments and political parties accountable for their repressive actions. And they also demonstrate a very practical means of using the digital technologies, including social media, in promoting peace building, conflict prevention, including support for the development and implementation of national action plans on women, peace and security, and recently youth peace and security. So for example, the members of the Young Women Plus, Leaders for Peace, Plus refers to LGBTQI community, QIA community, in the Philippines, produce a series of 10 vlogs or video blogs on how to use media for peace and counter disinformation, hatred, and violence. And in Indonesia, members of the same network that we helped organize promote the role of young women in countering violent extremism and sending out messages that challenge Islamophobia. It is also important to note for those who are working on the Women, Peace and Security agenda that there are now 120 national cybersecurity strategies and only 107 national action plans on women, peace, and security. But it's not surprising that cybersecurity or digital technologies broadly generate more attention from government. And neither it is a surprise that the strategies on cybersecurity and the national action plans on women, peace, and security are not at all connected. There's no discussions going on between the people who are working on national action plans on WPS and those that are working on cybersecurity strategies. And whenever gendered lens is integrated or mentioned in national cybersecurity strategies, it's usually only how women are represented or underrepresented in the technology sector. But it's never about how to stop, how to prevent sexual and gender-based violence promoted online. The lack of response from governments and telecommunication companies to gender digital divide, which is the other fundamental issue, and the use of digital technologies for propagating threats and inciting sexual and gender-based violence is highly disturbing. A more complex problem in cybersecurity intervention is when the governments misuse cybersecurity policies for political purposes, and they themselves become the cyber threat actors. For example, by silencing political opponents through attacks from paid trolls. Yes, there are governments who have troll farms, and I'm from the Philippines, so I know whereof I speak. There's a study by Oxford University on how the Duterte administration, the previous administration in the Philippines, used taxpayers' money to set up troll farms to discredit and attack political opponents. And a lot of misogynistic messages that were also part of their strategy. And using surveillance technologies or using the fight against disinformation as a pretext for prosecution. So I want to stress that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is one of the most important guardrails of digital technologies if we want them to serve the interests of women and girls, of all people, and the planet. It will help member states, civil society, telecommunication companies to come together and adopt guidelines that promote facts, defend democracy, promote feminist multilateralism, safeguard freedom of expression and information, while at the same time countering disinformation, conspiracies, and authoritarianism. I'll stop here to share the time with my fellow panelists, and looking forward to another round where I intend to present some recommendations. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary. There is a lot there, and I think you really did an excellent job in some sense of hitting this point about risks and opportunities that technology, all technology is in some sense morally ambivalent. It's positive and negative. You pointed that there's important tools here for peace building, but also it's instruments that are being manipulated for negative purposes. And it makes me think about you can tell that the first panel is really echoing in my head. Good job, Annika. That the point that Sasha made, that war is always a choice. That means peace is a choice, which means in this context, technology is ambivalent. It can be used for good or for bad. And so we need to make that conscious choice to institute the policies in order to put the weight on the scale towards the positive use of these tools. And you point very specifically to national action plans around cyber security and its relationship to gender, which I think is really, really a very concrete example. And also just thinking more broadly about how, and I think we've had discussions in this room around our gender and security, our women, peace and security work, that if you incorporate these elements into these spaces, whether it's cybersecurity or peace and security more broadly, it's not just about gender equality, although that's good. It benefits society as a whole. And that's a really, really important point. Wonderful. Much more, we'll have much more to discuss, but we'll move on now to our next panelist, Anne-Marie Buzatu, who is Executive Director of ICT for Peace Foundation. Previously, she was Deputy Head of the Public-Private Partnership Division at DCAF in Geneva. We had head of DCAF here earlier. She's had extensive work also in the ICT sector, so you actually build your own bridges. We've been talking a lot about bridges today, and so you're helping us to do that. Anne-Marie, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Adam. And I'm really happy to be here today representing Geneva, meeting New York. So happy to meet you. And I'd like to thank the organizers, the Geneva Peace Platform, IPI, and also the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs for your support and having this, I think, important conversation. My remarks are going to be a lot, mainly about how misinformation, disinformation impact peace, some of the challenges as well as opportunities. And I'm going to weave in a little AI in there as well. But before we go there, I'd like to hark back to a time where there was another major technological, say, revolution in humankind about 130, 140 years ago, when we had the internal combustion engine, which suddenly came on the streets, which had up to that point been used primarily for horse locomotion, carriages, horses. So there were some rules for that kind of locomotion, but suddenly we had these faster cars that had to figure out the new rules were, how did we operate these new technologies? We kind of understood what getting from A to B was, but if we did it faster, if we had to use, the cars in a different way, we had more cars eventually on the road. We had to figure out how to address these new challenges. And then fast forward just a little bit, few decades further, when we started getting planes. And we had just in the World War II, the creation of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, to come up with international rules for how do we use these planes that were flying in the skies, across borders, across different countries. So I just want to say that even though, and I've heard a lot of people say, I'm not a technology person, I don't understand technology, I don't know how it impacts or how we integrate it into our international regulatory frameworks, in our approaches at the UN. And I want to say, this is something new, and there's a lot that's very exciting about it, but it's also something that we have done before, and we need to figure out how we adapt it now. So just with that little setting the stage, I'm going to turn to misinformation, disinformation. I want to say also, just recently, and I think perhaps in large part due to the pandemic, we have had a great increase of more people coming online. The ITU, International Telecommunications Union, in a recent report said that now about 67% of the world population is online, with 1.7 billion people coming online since 2018, which is a huge number. So we are really growing more and more interconnected. And while there is still work to be done to get the rest of the world, the rest of the 2.6 billion people online, We are in this situation, which I think Hiba said earlier about escalating conflicts and growing globalization. We are becoming ever more interconnected. We are ever able to send and share and exchange information at faster speeds to more people than we ever have before. And so while misinformation and disinformation have always been present in our society, and you can find some very entertaining articles about misinformation in like 18th century France and different campaigns that people did to really spread information that was not true, tried to influence public opinion. What we're seeing now is that this is really being turbocharged by the expansion of digital connectivity, our mobile phones, our smartphones, messaging apps, social media. This is really taking this to a whole exponential level. And so it's impacting so many more. And now, of course, with the exponentially increasing, evolving explosion of generative AI, we now have more means to generate believable content and send it out at speeds that really are ones that we humans certainly have not really evolved to adapt to. So this is really the problem. We're seeing a lot of these impacts. It's in our more and more divided societies, in the conflicts that are going on right now. And these are driven by political drivers, economic interests, social tensions. And of course, as I said, with AI, this is only going to make this more. So what are we going to do about this? How can we actually respond to this challenge? And so I'm going to move now a little bit to what some of the things the UN has been doing on this. Now, there are a few major initiatives that are happening within the context of the UN that are looking at these new technologies. One is the draft UN Cybercrime Convention, which is being discussed right now, potentially being adopted early next year, but there's still lots of divisions on that, so that's not certainly for sure. There's also the open-ended working group that has been looking at the responsible use of ICTs, or information communication technologies, by states. And both of these initiatives have been looking at how to either hold accountable or behave responsibly in cyberspace. However, and I think worryingly, they really have not looked at misinformation and disinformation. Perhaps even more telling, this summer at the second substantive, or not second, no, it was the fifth substantive meeting of the open-ended working group, which they were adopting the second annual progress report. So this is a progress report. This is nothing more than a progress report. In the zero draft of this progress report, there was a mention of misinformation, disinformation, and deepfakes as a big risk for international peace and security. However, in the final version of this progress report that was adopted, that was dropped. And I don't know the politics behind that. Maybe some people who are watching this or in the room know more than I do. What it did is it dropped that reference to changing something a little bit more vague to ICT-enabled covert information campaigns by states. Now, that's certainly something that's very concerning, but it's also a much narrower part of that misinformation, disinformation pie. Now, turning to the Summit of the Future, however, this is one of the initiatives in which this has been mentioned. In their restatement of the SDGs through a technology lens, in both SDG 9, they talk about combating digital misinformation, and in SDG 10, they talk about how there needs to be a reduction in misinformation. So at least the words misinformation is there. But in terms of what does that mean? What do we do? How do we actually counter it? There's no detail there. And this is obviously a very big topic. We teach a whole course on this, so I'm not going to talk about how you can combat misinformation, disinformation in very granular terms. But what I think is important is to try to think about how would we actually approach it, which kind of brings me back to my rules of the road analogy. When we had these cars that came on the roads and we had these planes that started flying in the air, we realized we need to have some rules and we need to have some education. People need to know how to operate these new technologies responsibly. What were the ways to do them, use them in ways that had, that were less likely to have catastrophe? And I think that's what we need to think about when we're thinking, when we look at how we approach this. We need to have some rules and to educate people. What are the possible implications? You post this thing on the social media platform. What might happen to that? Who might that impact? Also, when you're reading something and you say, oh, that sounds great, I totally agree with that, and you forward it, maybe you should take a step back, look both ways before you cross the street, before you send off or forward that posting for it to become viral. And so if I were to say something that I'd hope the Summit for the Future would do, it would be really to translate what does it mean to use these technologies responsibly? And I'm talking broader now than misinformation, disinformation, I think also for AI. What does that mean? What are the concrete actions that we have to take? And we users are very, very important. Because while we have governments that regulate and we have companies that develop this, and we're going to hear from one very soon, we users are also the ones that are spreading this stuff. And so we do have, all of us have to work together to understand, first of all, what do we want? What is the kind of information ecosystem we want? How do we translate the existing kind of laws and human rights and rules to work in cyberspace? And then what do we have to do? What kind of education, what kind of work do we have to do? What kind of policies to actually bring this all together? So that's the end of my remarks. And thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you. Super concrete. And I love this beginning talking about some of the older technologies, because I mean, this technological transformation is in the DNA of modern society, right? It's something that the humanity has been dealing with for a long time, and look both ways before you cross the street. That didn't used to be something you needed to learn to do. You mentioned the ACIO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. It's one of my favorite examples of multilateralism that works. We often talk about the multilateral system is failing, it's falling apart, but whenever you get on a plane, it's thanks to the multilateral system because of the standards that are established by ICAO as law in the context of a multilateral setting. And what is often sort of talked about in that context is the mutual vulnerability that we experience when we get on a plane breeds cooperation. And it breeds innovation and cooperation, and that is something that we need to think about as these technologies develop. We're mutually vulnerable, and so we need these rules and education, as you point out. I wonder, and this is maybe flagging a question for the Q&A, is what comes to mind is questions of scale and speed. There's this sense that the issues of new technologies is happening so fast that our regulatory bodies can't catch up, and the private sector is really in the lead, and non-state actors of various kind in the dark corners of the web are in the lead, and you said misinformation is being turbocharged, right? How do we catch up with that? I mean, one thing though, I think. There are fast people on the positive side of the scale as well, right? That Mavic mentioned in terms of the gender cybersecurity issue. It's the women they're not passive actors. They're out there countering this hate speech in real time, and we need to empower those actors as well. But of course, I flagged the private sector. And so our next speaker is here. Well, not just as a representative of the private sector, but he is senior director and head of Microsoft's UN and international organizations policy team. but he hasn't always been in that side. He also has experience in government. He was both worked at the UN and at the U.S. mission to the UN, U.S. Department of State, and elsewhere. Vastly, a lot of experience to share with us. Howie, please share us your wisdom.
Thanks very much. And thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to be here. I'm happy to speak on behalf of the entire private sector and the entire US government and the UN, or just myself. So I think just at the outset, just to reiterate a couple of the comments that have already been made, this is obviously a very broad subject. How do we harness the latest technology to build a better future, including in particular areas like peace building, or in the cyber world, things that are kind of well known, especially those of you following the UN's work. Not surprisingly, technology is both a tool and a weapon. We just heard examples about flying planes or driving cars. These are older technologies, but the lessons we learn from those episodes can be applied going forward as well. I think it's all essentially up to how you apply these different technologies and what lessons you're learning from those experiences as well, And I think broadly speaking, kind of as this relates to some of the more recent questions that the UN has been facing, we see the Global Digital Compact process and the Summit of the Future. On the one hand, we see the SDG Summit trying to make progress, or at the midway point of trying to get where we need to be on the Sustainable Development Goals. And in engaging with colleagues in the UN system, it seemed that sometimes these things were in tension. There were those who wanted to focus more on the Global Digital Compact process and the Summit of the Future because technology is important these days, and AI is coming, and we need to be prepared, and the UN system needs to have an answer for all of this. Whereas others were saying, we can't detract from the SDGs. The SDGs are vitally important. We need to reach our goals by 2030. And I think from my perspective, at least, the reality is these things are hugely interconnected and intertwined. One can't happen without the other. From where we sit, I think the use of technology, the use of cloud computing, AI, data, all of these things together can really turbocharge and accelerate progress on the SDGs. So when you're thinking in terms of the opportunity that exists to kind of use these latest technologies to drive positive change in the world, this is where we can really make a difference. And I think, sort of given how broad this subject is, maybe I'll start by talking about some of the opportunities, discussing some of the risks as well, although we've talked about a number of the risks already, and then maybe how to approach this either from a governance perspective or some lessons learned that we can glean so far, not only from the previous use of technologies, but even what we've seen over the course of the last 15 years that we've learned from the rollout of social media, for example. So let me kind of just start with the opportunities, and there are a number of different ways we can go here. I'll just kind of focus on a handful of things, some which may be obvious, some which are not. On opportunities, I'll start with the digital divide that exists. We often get asked the question, especially in the context of AI, well, how are you going to handle the AI divide? How are you going to handle the AI divide when the digital divide is already so problematic? And I think one way to look at this is a point that Brad Smith, Microsoft's president, raised during an engagement at the SDG Pavilion during UN High Level Week a couple months ago. He said, look back to when the New York Times building was first electrified back in the late 1800s. That was a pivotal moment. It was the first time any building in the United States was run exclusively on electricity. And you fast forward to today, and you realize that there are still 770 million people that lack access to electricity. And then if you kind of zoom out a little bit more, and we just heard some stats about all of the great work the ITU has done to broadband connectivity to the world. And yet there's still so much more to do. 2.7 billion people remain offline because connectivity is either not available, not affordable, or not accessible. So when you look at how many people still lack access to basic things like electricity or the internet, you don't even approach that third question of, well, what about AI? We have so much work to do on those even, far more basic items like electricity and broadband before we even get to those later questions. And why is that important? I think even if you remove AI from the discussion for now, things like digital connectivity are vitally important. They're indispensable these days and kind of fundamental to everything that we're doing. You need high-speed internet for things like education, healthcare, access to critical services, distance learning, telemedicine, e-commerce. If you don't have these things, you really can't participate in society the way most of us have become accustomed to. And this is a recent change in the last 15, 20, 25 years, but it's a hugely important change as well. And you can look at all of the progress in this recent window of history and say, I barely remember what life was like before digital connectivity. Think about the range of things you do. And now think about all the folks in the world, over 2 billion people, who still can't participate in this form of the economy because they lack access to electricity or they lack access to digital connectivity. So I think, for us, in terms of opportunities, this is where we can make a real difference. Digital connectivity, trying to get as many people access to the internet and broadband as possible. At Microsoft, we have something called the Airband Initiative. We are trying to connect, or at least expand connectivity to 250 million people around the world, including 100 million people in Africa by the end of 2025. And this is kind of hugely important to our mission, and it's consistent with SDG 9 as well, which we just kind of heard about a little bit earlier. So that's digital connectivity. Another example I'll give is in the peace building space. For peace building, whether peace building, conflict prevention, peace building, there's so many areas that are ripe for opportunity. You look at data and cloud computing or AI systems that can be used to sift through data points in dozens of languages. There were efforts underway, for example, in UNSMIL, the UN Special Mission in Libya, to try this out. The technology there was used to kind of try to develop a unified currency. And it's the sort of thing that we can use in other contexts as well, trying to fuse data and AI with the cloud in ways that are meaningful and can really make a difference. The same is true in conflict prevention. I think the best example for us here is related to severe weather events. Microsoft's AI for Good Lab has a relationship with the World Meteorological Organization, where we try to predict severe weather events like hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, flooding. We do this by kind of using geospatial data, high-resolution satellite imagery, machine learning techniques to try to get ahead of problems before they happen. And when they do happen, as we saw with kind of the wildfires in Maui, try to figure out a way to help rapid response efforts as best as possible and pinpoint using satellite technology exactly where the situation is worsening and how we can kind of combine forces with governments and international organizations or nonprofits to try to, make a difference in that situation. So I think whether from a peace building perspective, a conflict prevention perspective, these are different ways where the latest technologies, can really improve the current situation. Something very kind of adjacent that we have is Global Renewables Watch. This is something that Microsoft does jointly with Planet Labs and the Nature Conservancy. This is a way for us to map and measure solar and wind installations using AI and satellite imagery. So this is the sort of data where putting all of this together can sort of help us understand, visualize, and anticipate not only weather events, but ways to apply green solutions to certain regions of the world. So bringing all of these latest tools together and doing this in a way that is both transparent and partners with other members of the private sector or jointly with governments is sort of the way to kind of bring fruit to bear in these scenarios. So that's the sort of the opportunities. The risks, we've heard about a number of them already, and the risks are profound. I think we shouldn't be naive about technology broadly, especially in the aftermath of what we've seen, the rise of social media. Some of this technology can be used to spread mis and disinformation, to commit acts of violence, to commit acts of bias and discrimination, to muddy up an elections process. We need to have our eyes wide open about all of this. It's not it's not all sunshine and flowers. There are serious risks that we need to consider. So I think one of the important things, and I think interestingly enough, this is kind of, you'll hear tomorrow from Amandeep Gill, this UN high-level advisory body on AI. This is kind of how they've broken down their work as well. They've got one group of folks identifying opportunities, one group of folks looking at risks and challenges, and then a third group of folks looking at the international governance of AI. And I think that's a useful framework that we should consider about technology broadly. What are the opportunities? What are the risks? And then where do we go from there? In terms of lessons learned from previous experiences and the things we should think about when it comes to protecting against the risks, incorporating safeguards into these technologies, and trying to create a sense of some semblance of a governance architecture, which are really going to be unique to the technology involved and the actors involved. I think just a handful of things I want to highlight, which is, and some of these will be obvious, but no one country or government can address these issues alone. I think we all realize that. And these are the sorts of things where you really need governments working closely with industry, with NGOs, with academia, with international organizations, coming together and trying to problem solve. Governments don't always have the same expertise as folks in the private sector, don't understand the latest forms of technology. The private sector obviously does not have the same incentives as governments do. And then academics and researchers or folks in NGOs are coming from their own unique vantage points. And I think having everyone at the table and embracing this sort of form of multi-stakeholderism is crucially important. And I think that's been one of the real benefits of this global digital compact process and the Summit of the Future, is allowing a multitude of different voices into the room, not only governments, to try to explain, from very unique perspectives, how all these things come together, what the opportunities are, what the risks are, and what the way forward might be. Another thing to keep in mind is, I think when you have a governance architecture in place, or you're trying to erect something that will work, the days of sort of the international institutions, like the Security Council, like the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, creating a general framework of rules that everyone follows, we're in a different world than we were even 10 years ago, certainly 30 years ago. What we're beginning to see now is more of a patchwork of different governance efforts. And I think if you zoom out on that, if that is the new normal, that what we're going to see is not just edicts from national governments or from the UN Security Council or from the EU, you need some semblance of compatibility and interoperability when dealing with this technology. If not, if you're in a situation where you have different standards in every country in the world, it's not something that's going to work. This is sort of the genius behind the International Civil Aviation Organization, was creating this framework that allowed planes to take off and land in different countries that has proven to be effective. So related to that, I think, is don't over rely on the institutions we've all come to understand and appreciate in recent years. I think be open to new ideas. These are new technologies. These aren't necessarily new problems, but we shouldn't let older institutions that aren't always capable of adapting prevent us from coming up with new solutions to these relatively new sets of problems. I think that a couple other things is that we should identify kind of at the outset when you're trying to put in place safeguards exactly what problem you're trying to solve. I think too often, including what we're seeing from the Global Digital Compact process and the Summit of the Future, is it can be a grab bag of a lot of different things to a lot of different people, depending on who's speaking and who the audience is. Is the purpose of an international organization to promote opportunities? Is it to fix the digital divide? Is it to prevent against certain risks? If so, which risks? Is it only the high risk use cases, or is it all risks? Or is it something else? Is it ultimately just sort of the least common denominator of what a majority of states in the international community can agree upon? And so I do think, though, at the outset, it's important to figure out what question you want to answer and what collective action problem you want to solve before you go too far down a road and then realize that you're duplicating efforts in other spaces or you're solving a problem that doesn't need to be solved. And then maybe the final point I'll make is that, we shouldn't be, these are new technologies, but these aren't new problems. We've been here before. We're capable of solving them. I think what's different is, frankly, the speed with which we're able to communicate with other countries and governments and industry. I mean, this is unparalleled at any point in history. And the fact that you have so many more players capable of bringing a voice to this conversation than ever before. So while we all share, I think, the aim of making technology transparent and safe and responsible, I think we can do that these days, in a much more inclusive way with a lot more tools at our disposal. So maybe I'll kind of leave it at that and see what questions we have.
Fantastic, thank you. We're really keeping on message here in this panel about the risks, opportunities, and then governance structures. Although it's interesting that the private sector, you flipped the script. You started with the opportunities, which is maybe a lesson for how private sector thinks about things, which is important. And on that, I think your first point about it. This is not an agenda item that should be seen as in competition with others. It's not address the SDGs or address new technologies. We did some work actually with Microsoft earlier last year on thinking about digital connectivity as in part SDG 0, right? We're all talking about the need to advance the SDGs. Connectivity can be that accelerator. But one of the lessons for me out of that process was, yes, we want people connected in order to have the benefits to be included and such, but not everybody wants to be connected in the same way, with the same content that we think they want to be connected with. Nobody wants to be surveilled by their government, and nobody wants to be harassed online. So it's connectivity, but a certain kinds of connectivity that we need to be aware of. And so, and this is now we're heading into the Q&A. And so part of my question when I think about this is that the private sector clearly has a role in investing in these infrastructures, setting it up, and thinking about the positive elements that these tools can be used for. You mentioned conflict prevention, early warning systems, and things like that. But going back to Anne-Marie's point about the need for rules in education. What is the private sector for this on the normative side of things, on the rules? I mentioned before, I'm not an expert on this topic, but we've been reading the story about OpenAI, the CEO left and came back, and the headline from the New York Times was "The Capitalists Won." And the assumption is that the capitalists in that equation were only out there to pursue the advance of the technology for their own motives, and not in this kind of more normative level of looking to the future about how we can improve our rules and education around these issues. So what's the role for the private sector in that side of thing? You mentioned that what we are seeing as a result is this kind of patchwork frameworks, what AR theorists would call regime complexity in some way. And I think there's lessons to learn from that about all parts of the multilateral system right now, in terms of the tensions between multipolarity, fragmentation, and the universal system of norms and rules and law that is at risk. We need this kind of innovation, but we want to keep it in a way that's complementary and positive. Great. So we are open. The floor is open for questions. I know we've already had a little bit of a conversation before. I've got some questions, but I'd like to give the opportunity to the audience to engage. We also have our online audience. Anybody online who would like to engage, just write it in the chat. Yes, and I've got Keith Cross here. Please, Keith.
So I have a couple of questions and a provocation. First question, and I'm going to direct them mostly to you, but they're not exclusively to you. Yeah, as the spokesman for the entire private sector. I think you start by saying connectivity will improve the achievement of the SDGs. There's a big claim. Do we have any evidence for it? And what kind of theory of change is behind that? Like, in what ways will connectivity actually achieve, and what kind of sectors achieve any SDGs specifically? And I think that's a general comment that comes with many of the assertions about factor X will lead to achievement of the SDGs. I think we really have to think harder about that. The second is, you talk a little bit about the risks and costs. And I think that's really important, because one way to think about risks is that they're something that one insures against, in which case you want to know something about probability, but also extent of damage, et cetera, et cetera. And yet here, the first two presentations were focused on risks that would actually be, the cost of which would be borne primarily at the level of individuals and communities. And it's particularly true when we talk about the gendered effects of certain forms of disinformation or malicious spreading of information, et cetera. So I wonder if the risk calculus is sort of collective, broad scale, like a community will burn down if there's a fire, or if it can actually drill down and capture the risks that individuals are facing from this. And then the third curveball, I was sitting here thinking about the next panel. And one of this is all contestable data, but it does say that future energy demand of the internet could double by around 2030 and reach 5% of global electricity use by 2030. I'm not so sure increased connectivity, especially use of AI, large language models, high-speed internet, and all those good things you talk about, is compatible with any of the things we're going to talk about in the next panel about dealing with climate crisis. So that's my curveball at you, at everybody actually on the panel.
Great. Any other? Yes, please. So, yeah.
No, first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting and informative panel, also very concrete, and I really appreciated this, because I'm not a specialist either, but everything you said I understood, so it's good. my question is in relation to regulation. So there has been some proposals to indeed regulate these challenges and regulate the use of technology, and including on the internet side. And I'm wondering, is it really the right way? Is it, I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I love everything about regulation, but I'm still asking some question about this particular field. And the next question in relation to that is, if we go down that way of regulating through a normative, let's say, approach to these issues, will it be really enforceable? We are talking about private actors, individuals, scattered around the world. I mean, how will we enforce that kind of things? And let alone talking about some states that are really against this kind of route that is proposed. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions for? Yes, please, sir.
Thank you. Yes, Safet Kadovic from Justice for All. Yeah, two questions. One is thoughts on transnational repression, and specifically the targeting was mentioned. Misinformation, disinformation is not included in the recent UN work on this subject. And the targeting across borders of individuals, especially I come from the human rights area, those who are working in the area of human rights. So that's not within countries, that's across borders in other countries. And secondly, the whole idea of there's the sort of the ecosystems that are always being talked about, but then there's sort of this metaverse and meta universe that's being set up outside of the entire international structures. Headed by one man and company. So I just and the fact of the matter is, according to Center for Countering Digital Hatred, with regard to specifically the issue of Islamophobia that was mentioned during one of the presentations, 89% of anti-Muslim posts and Islamophobic content is not taken down, and this has real consequences in the world in terms of people's lives. And so I just wanted to sort of figure out, when you're talking about the private sector is more powerful than many nation states, and has this transnational power. We see it playing itself out with what happened with Musk and the whole situation in Gaza and Israel. So I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think that's a lot on the table. Unless there's another hand that wants to shoot up quickly. Howie, you got directly called out. There's a lot of questions about the private sector, but I think that there's questions for the whole panel here. This point about costs and whether we're talking how we can think about both individual costs and community costs is important. The call for all of us about energy demand, I think, is interesting, and maybe that was something that we could raise with the next panel. And this question about the regulatory model, and is it enforceable? And is there another way to think about how we can establish these rules and education, as mentioned? I don't know. Interesting. And the cross-border question, targeting cross-border. When you were talking, I know this is not really what you're referring to, but it occurred to me that we talked about cybersecurity. Haven't talked about cyber warfare actually as an issue, but the role of the private sector actually in countering digital hatred of various forms is important. But Howie, that was one or two questions directly related to you. So we'll go to you first, and then we can come back to the other members.
Sure, and thanks for those questions. I think on digital connectivity, and first I'll make a plug, because each year we do a report on Microsoft's commitment to the SDGs, and I had the pen on it this year. So please find it online, and we've got many pages on how we would answer this question. But I would just say on digital connectivity, certainly there are positives and negatives. More electricity use has its downsides. But I mean, look, on things like being able to just contribute to society, access to healthcare, access to education, that's where we see some concrete results. Being able to get kids in rural villages in Africa remote learning, for example, that's something tangible. And these are things that we track very closely. We have sort of an education team and a Microsoft philanthropies team, and certainly our airband team that is monitoring all of this closely. We have sort of more statistics. I don't want to get too far into the details here, but we've got all of this readily available. You know, I also want to, you know, I kind of want to address the question on, do we need regulations and are they enforceable? How do we know they will be enforceable? Because I think this is something that we've thought about. I've thought about this a lot personally, including in my previous life, but also a lot more since I started at Microsoft a mere 6 months ago. You know, I think that you know, on the question of do we need regulations, at least from a Microsoft perspective, the answer has been clear from the top, which is yes. You know, one of the big lessons learned from recent history, especially with social media, is you can't just let the private sector alone to police itself. You know, in fact, when Microsoft came out back in May with a blueprint for a proposed blueprint for governing AI, there were a series of principles. The first principle was to implement and build upon government-led AI frameworks. You know, also the need to sort of develop legal and regulatory frameworks as well. So I think this is an essential piece of the puzzle. This is a really key component. But to your second point, you know, what form this should take, and I mentioned before, we see this like sort of lattice work of national or regional regulations paired with you know, principles from or in codes of conduct from the G7 or UN Security Council resolutions, or you know, activity from other international organizations or groups of like-minded countries. I think increasingly what we're seeing is language from individual governments or regions, and then international organizations, and then echo chamber is the wrong phrase, but they're reinforcing one another, typically in positive ways. And that is the way I think we're seeing these days how customary international law is concretizing. You know, if we see language in a US executive order and a G7 document, and then in a UN document, it is underscoring the same principles, and it's making clear that the international community is coming around in favor of certain principles that are taking on the force of customary international law. But in terms of enforceability, that's an entirely separate question that's frankly really difficult to answer, because these days there's a huge difference between implementation and enforcement. I spent a lot of time in my previous life working on sanctions. Enforcement is a real concern. And in the international system, even if you are able to create international binding legal obligations through a Security Council resolution or a treaty, even those are really, really difficult to monitor and enforce. So I think what we're seeing increasingly is self-policing, not just from individual companies, but also through a process of naming and shaming. Like the Financial Action Task Force is a good example where countries really care about their reputations. And if you're included on a gray list, for example, then certain businesses will refuse to do work with your government. So we're seeing different ways to tackle this enforcement problem, but I think it's a really good one. And I'm sorry, on the first question on you know, the impact of AI, for example, on climate, it's actually great timing because we have another panel discussion on this later. So I don't want to get into that too much, but COP is coming up starting on Thursday. So I'll sort of do a little bit of a dodge, but we've got a ton of information about to be released in a couple of days addressing this exact question. I think this isn't a new question, but it's a really important question, and one our Chief Sustainability Officer has devoted a lot of time to.
Great, thank you so much. Anne-Marie, please.
Thank you. And I will not really touch those first set of questions so much either, although I mean, it's something that concerns me a lot more generally, how much energy we are using, not just with AI, but with so many things. And we haven't really, I think, made the kinds of transformations that we need to with electricity and sustainable electricity. I'll go to places where I'm more comfortable, which is international law and regulation. And so to Anissa, to your question, regulation is it the right way, and is a normative approach enforceable? And I tend to look at this question a little bit differently, because also being an international lawyer by training, the whole notion of international law is based on effective control. And that was traditionally what the states had. They had the idea, the theory, the fiction, or, to some degree, truth, was the states were responsible for what was on their territory. And so then they had the responsibility to enforce it on their territory. And so when you had a treaty, that's what the states said. They said, okay, I'm going to do this stuff on my territory. It didn't go to the individuals living there. But now we're in a situation where we can't really convincingly say that states have effective control over this. Cyber space, metaverse, we can talk about that too. So if I were to deconstruct this a little bit, I would try to look at, okay, what is this made up of? If we consider that cyberspace is a kind of territory or some dominion of some kind, and I know that servers are physically located in places, I'm not saying that, but at the same time, realistically, because we're not surveilling the information that goes on every computer, and we don't want that, what does it mean in terms of who can do what? So who has the effective control over what part? And if we're talking about social media platforms, or it's the companies that have effective control over that. If we're talking about having a coercive ability to coerce something, or to fine big fines, that could be a state, or it could be through a contract means. And then in terms of our own responsibilities as users and citizens of this, again, I would go to the education part. And so if you're trying to think, okay, well, we want a cyberspace which is safe and secure, which, as much as we can, we want to make where we have access to it. What do we need to do that? Who needs to do what? And we need to identify which actors, states, companies, academics, civil society, what is their piece of that effective control pie? And then that's their responsibility. And I think that needs to be very clearly and concretely defined. And then how do we enforce that? I think we have to look a little bit differently at how we do things on an international level, because that's the international world that we live in. This morning, we were talking about how do we remake the UN system for it to be effective? I think we really need to have a hard look at what is our society like now, and who has the levers of power, and then assign those responsibilities. And of course, you're not going to have a perfect system, but you may have one that works better. And then one last thing around the metaverse and the content online along similar lines, because it is largely the private sector that has that control and has the ability to take down that content or not. And of course, different companies are located in different jurisdictions. They have different freedom, free speech regulations and standards. So even that's not universal. But let's not overlook the fact that those companies generally get their income by the algorithms that reinforce content. It's an advertising model most of the time. And so the algorithms have been developed so that the more clicks and reactions that the postings get, the more money they get from their advertisers. And so if those clicks or those postings are like evoking a lot of emotional responses, even if they're Islamophobic or wrong, or misinformation is information, there's a strong incentive nevertheless for them to stay online. So we need to understand that. And again, we need to adapt then our notions of free speech and the kinds of values in cyberspace that we want to have to then say, this is what the companies need to do. These are the regulations, these are the norms. And I think norms may be more powerful in this way just because of the nature, until we figure out the better way to really do things on an international basis. So.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're coming up on our coffee break, but I want to turn to Mavic, and maybe this is a good sort of way to sort of close out the panel. I know you had some very specific recommendations that you wanted to provide, but also the floor on the questions is posed to you as well. So Mavic, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I want to respond to the question on the role of private sector in responding to demands globally to counter hatred, disinformation, and violence online. And they are, as you've also mentioned, some of these telecommunication companies are bigger than governments. They, the way they operate transnationally, and I'm pretty sure the profits that they amass are bigger than many governments' GDP. I think we really need to challenge them, we, civil society primarily, in moving away from their damaging business models. And as Anne-Marie also already pointed out, the algorithms that they use don't differentiate between negative propaganda, between disinformation, and the few, the small percentage of positive and useful messages. And our organization, the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, we aligned ourselves to the campaign called Stop Hate for Profit campaign. And part of that was we said, okay, before we abandon social media, let's first talk to some of these social media companies. And we did with Facebook or Meta. And we were able to connect to their department that's working on human rights and gender equality. And we've had so many exchanges, email, and we had calls. But in the end, it became clear to us that it's a token gesture from this telecommunication company that they're, that they have efforts to prevent violence online and attacks against women's rights activists and women peace builders. It became very, very clear. They had all sorts, they were supposed to train the local women peace builders and youth peace builders we work with, and on how to, how to use their platform safe. But in the end, they had, really ridiculous excuses that in the end did not happen. And the interesting thing too is these companies are smart in hiring civil society activists. Some of their staff are former civil society activists and staff of governments that are working on peace and security issues. But they only take their marching orders from their bosses, and of course from their board, who underscore profit first before thinking of making their platform safe. But I also come to think of some promising civil society protest initiatives apart from this Stop Hate for Profit campaign. I recall when there was news about X, or the former Twitter platform, some news about the firing of its human rights team, and news about Trump returning to the platform. There were quite a number of influencers and regular users who left the platform. To what extent that really harmed the business, I don't know, but it's still, there was some impact. But is it enough impact? I don't think so, but it's something we can build on. And which also brings me to the point about regulation. I used to work with media, meaning the more established media, print, TV, radio. And apart from government regulations, which in some countries are really enforced, in some they're not, we had codes of conduct among practitioners. And again, how the codes of conduct are enforced vary from one country to another, but I would say in many cases they were largely effective, but it's very hard to use the same model of regulation and self-regulation in the ICTs or information communication technologies because of its nature, of its rapid development and the transnational operations. But I think there are specific areas of actions that could be regulated. For example, demanding these telecommunication companies to monitor content and to report regularly to Congress or other bodies on their income. Where are they coming from? And are they coming from political parties? Are they coming from rich people who support rightist and conspiracy groups? Then the government can really do something about that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This has been such a rich discussion. I think as we planned, we've talked quite a bit about risks and the opportunities, and then the need for more governance structures, whether it's regulation or codes of conduct, rules, education. And I think this kind of last part of the conversation hit on this point about incentives. In some sense, how do you actually get people to do this action, which was a big part of the conversation earlier. How do you move away from some of the damaging business models? Hiba in the earlier panel said we need more midwives for peace. And so I kind of close this panel just thinking about a question for all of us is how can we populate online spaces with more midwives for peace instead of voices for division? And that seems to me to be a job for everybody, for governments, for international institutions, for private sector, and for individuals, regular users, something that we can all keep in mind. So thank you. This has really, really been an excellent panel. Thank you so much.